This is my presentation on Veterans in the U.S. Society project. Now, I just want to start off by saying I had issues uploading my video to with Panopto, so I'm having to do this presentation and upload it to YouTube. I'll also include with my presentation when I upload it, I'll include the PowerPoint that goes along with it, so just bear with me here. So starting off, the first question was, what was your project? Now, originally I had decided that I wanted to do my project at the American Legion, but it just so happened that when I contacted them to set up an appointment for my project, the commander who I had to get approval from to do my project was actually out of town for several weeks, and by the time he got back it would have been too late and past the due date for the project. So I had to go to the VFW, which is the Veterans of Foreign Wars, which wasn't a big issue. They're still in the same town, still, all my reasons for going to them is the same. Now, my project actually included 3 parts. The first part was that I would go to the VFW and do non-participant observational research, which was basically just, sitting back and watching how the veterans interacted with each other, just see, how their conversations go, how they interact, what they do. And then the second part of my project was interviewing veterans, and that interviewing part was, just doing 20-minute interviews with 3 veterans. And then the last part of the project was transcribing those interviews, which actually takes a long time to do. And so those are the 3 parts of my project. Now, the second question was that why did you choose that particular project? Now, I chose this project because the organizations are in my local community. The VFWs in my local community as well as the American Legion, so that reason stayed the same. Another reason is my grandfather actually goes there. He goes to the VFW and the American Legion, and is a member of both. And then the third reason why I chose this particular project is because I wanted to go into an environment that was like a pure veteran environment, where it was just veterans interacting with each other. And so the VFW was a great place to do that, because the only people who are allowed to be members and go there are people who are veterans of foreign wars. So the only people who were there that I was observing and interviewing were actual veterans, and there were no civilians around there. Now, the third question was, how was your project related to the learning objectives of this course? Now, the learning objectives of this course was to examine how the veterans interact with each other and how they actually interact with society in general, and in reintegrating into society after their service. So this specific project actually examines veterans within the Venice community, which is in the U.S., and the name of the class is Veterans in the U.S., so it's actually very on topic. And then there were actually 2 parts to the project. It was a service learning project, so the learning part of the project was my observational research and the interviews, so interviewing the veterans, observing how they interact with each other. That's the learning part for me. And then the service portion of the project was the transcribing of the interviews, so that I could give those to the veterans, so that they have, that record of their story, of their service and their experiences in the military, what life was like for them before, during, and after the military. And that's my service to them, is providing them with those transcripts. Now, what were some of the assumptions discussed in the pre-flexion exercise that you had going into the project? So one of my assumptions was I figured that, me going into a purely veteran context as a non-veteran, I figured they probably wouldn't want to be bothered by me, somebody who's not a veteran going into their context and asking them questions and, wanting to do interviews and stuff like that. However, I figured, probably the majority of them would be happy to share their experiences if I asked. And then another assumption of mine was that of my own nervousness going in as an outsider, as a non-veteran, going into a purely veteran cultural context and going out of my comfort zone into their context and doing those interviews, asking questions, talking to them, and observing them. I just figured I'd probably be pretty nervous going into that. Now, what happened on the actual days of the project? So the day one was me just formulating my own research questions or my own interview questions. So I took an hour and a half to just go through and I formulated my own interview questions. I went through and thought through, put a lot of thought into what questions would be good questions to ask the veterans. So I came up with about 2 pages of questions, and then I went to the VFW and I did 3 hours of non-observation or non-participant observational research. So I just kind of sat back for 3 hours and watched how the veterans interacted with each other. And then there were actually complications with the interviews themselves. So when I had called to set up my appointment with them at the VFW, the commander there said, "Oh yeah, you can come in, do your project." I explained the project and everything that it entailed, and he said, "Yeah, you can come in and do that." And then on day one, he comes to me afterwards and says, after I do my 3 hours of non-participant observation, he says, "So in order to do the actual interviews, you have to get approval from the top commander." I guess he was the lieutenant commander or something. But then there was no contact information for me to reach the top commander at, so I had to leave a message with the bartender, and then he didn't get back to me until, way later, and I missed his call, and then I called back several times trying to reach him, and that didn't work out. So it turns out I wasn't actually able to contact him, but on that first day, one of the veterans had heard that I was doing interviews and came over to me and said, "Hey, I'd like you to interview me." And so, I didn't want to disappoint him and say, "No, I'm not going to interview you because I haven't gotten approval from the commander." It wasn't like I was going to ask him to do an interview. He was the one who came to me, so I figured that would be okay. So I went ahead and interviewed him, did a little 20-minute interview, and that was fine with them. And then the second day, I still wasn't able to reach the commander to get approval to do the other interviews. So I decided, okay, I'm no longer going to do my interviews at the VFW. I'm going to go to other veterans that I know. So I went to my grandfather, who frequents the VFW and the American Legion, and I did my 20-minute interview with him. And then the third day, I went to a friend who I knew was a veteran, and asked him to do an interview, and he was able to do that. So I did an interview with him, and that happened to be 32 minutes, a little bit longer because he had longer answers to my questions. And then day 4 is just the transcriptions, which is about 4.5 hours. So then when reflecting on the project, what were some of your major takeaways from the service? So one of my big takeaways was that I was actually kind of surprised that most of my assumptions going in were wrong. The veterans did not seem bothered by me at all being there and observing how they interacted with each other. They all knew I was there observing them, doing the non-participant observation. And they didn't seem bothered by it at all. They just kind of carried on with their own personal conversations and whatnot. And then one of the other things about that was that the other assumption that was wrong was I wasn't nervous at all going in. I didn't have any nervousness doing the interview with the veteran and being there observing them. There wasn't any issue there. And then Another takeaway from the project was that two of the veterans I interviewed were in the Korean conflict in the 50s and 60s, and then the third veteran was an Afghan veteran. So the first two veterans that I interviewed from the Korean conflict said they had no issues readjusting to civilian life, which was kind of surprising to me. I thought, going out of your civilian life context into a military context and then back into civilian life, I would have figured that they would have had at least some issue coming back, but they said no, they had no issues coming back to American society, and it was basically exactly the way they left it. And then, but on the other hand, the Afghanistan veteran that I interviewed said that, yeah, he did have a few issues coming back and readjusting to civilian life. So it was a little bit difficult for him. And then my third takeaway from this project was that all three veterans that I interviewed experienced culture shock upon entering the military. And that was, that wasn't something that I was surprised about. I expected that it would be culture shock because you're going into, you're coming out of your civilian life and going into a very structured, rigorous military environment that's very different from civilian life. So, that wasn't a surprise to me, but that was one of the bigger points of the project. Now, based on your experiences, what, if anything, would you have done differently? So one of the things I would have done differently is I definitely would have scheduled with the American Legion to do my project a lot further in advance. Because I waited so long, I wasn't able to get approval from the commander because he happened to be out of town for like several weeks. So I would have gone, what I should have done is I should have gone in like a month, maybe 2 months beforehand and say, hey, this is the date I want to do this project, can I get approval for it? And then the other thing I would have done differently is I would have tried to set up more interviews with veterans from more recent conflicts, especially I would have liked to interview a veteran from the Vietnam War, just because it was a different context, a different time, with different civilian responses to the war and to the veterans themselves when they came back. So I would have liked to get a perspective from the Vietnam War, but just circumstances didn't permit that. And then moving on, what would you recommend this project to another student taking this class, and why? I would say yes, definitely. I would recommend this project to any student taking this class because it's a great experience to interact with veterans and hear their story, hear what it was like for them going into the military, coming out of the military, their experiences while they were in the military. It's just a great experience to interact with veterans when you're talking with them about their specific experiences. And then also, I think it's a great project because it's a good way to get more involved in the community and to be more engaged with veterans and in society in general. One of the problems with today is people are becoming less engaged in the community and less engaged in society. So this project is really a good way to get more engaged and be a part of your community. So that was those are the reasons why I would say you should take this class and should do this project, is because it's just a great experience to get more involved. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.